Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Inside the Arena podcast. Today, we'll be shining a spotlight on the very, very important issues that affect a lot of individuals in our society, and which is the intersection of mental health and the criminal justice system. And joining us today for this very crucial conversation is Jenny Okolo, whose first-hand experience working in inpatient psychiatric hospitals and prisons gives her unique insights into this particular issue. Hello, Jenny. How you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. What an introduction. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I like to leave my guests to kind of like introduce themselves properly because most times I just feel like I probably don't do it enough justice. So, with that in mind, with that in mind, I'll just please like you to introduce yourself, so the audience can get a sense of who you are and get familiar with you a little bit before we get into the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So you touched on quite a few things already. But as mentioned, I'm Jenny. I'm based in the UK. I'm an occupational therapist working in mental health, so psychiatry in particular. And I do also work on the forensic side, hence why I work in prisons. Most people don't know what occupational therapy is, but it's not physiotherapy, it's not occupational health. Essentially, we work as part of the multidisciplinary team. So that's amongst nurses, doctors, social workers, and whatnot. And we essentially look at supporting that person in regaining back their independence, whether they've had a relapse in their mental health, or we can also work on the physical side as well, for example, working with people who have traumatic brain injury. So we are dual trained, but I've chosen specifically to work in mental health just because, I've always been interested in mental health, and I'm sure we'll sort of touch into that subject as well. And like I said, I work in prisons. I work also in the community as well, so supporting people with reintegration back into the community um, after release or after discharge. I'm also a speaker as well. So um, I've well, not recently, but it's come out this year, my TED Talk with the NHS, which is our National Health Service, again, touching on issues around mental health, neurodiversity, especially within the criminal justice system. Um, and aside from that, I also have my business SASA, which focuses on supporting people with mental health needs and neurodiversity screenings. We're a small team, but it's something that I'm quite passionate about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I saw. I took a deep dive into your business, Sasa. I want to commend you for doing a very amazing job, and like always, I'm rooting for you, and just keep going. And I'm very, very sure everything will work out at the end.
Thank you.
So, um, you just talked about what the role of an occupational therapist, which if I'm being really honest, this particular researching to come have this particular conversation is when I fully got a real insight about what occupational therapy is and what your job entails and the rest of it. But I would also like to ask, how does occupational therapy specifically fits into the criminal justice system, and what do you do in that field?
Yeah. So we do quite a lot of things, but we focus mainly on supporting people with their daily function. Obviously, in prisons, it's quite restrictive anyway. So we do a lot of cognitive assessments, again, for people who might have a cognitive decline who are in prison, those who don't have like the basic daily living skills. So whether that's cooking, finding them a job, looking at their CV. Even building a routine as well, especially for those who either have been in prison for many, many years. They tend to lose some of those daily functioning skills so that when they do get released into the community, they're not left, with nothing essentially to sort of take care of themselves. We also do, so for me, I do sensory assessments as well. So working with people who have um, ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and various neurodevelopmental conditions whilst in prison. So again, like I said, it's quite restrictive. It can be really loud. The cells are super small. So, of course, this is the worst place for somebody who's neurodivergent to be in. But at the same time, this is not a hospital, it's a prison. So that's why they employ people like ourselves to come into the prison and provide a clinical service in that sense. And then, like I said, I play a small part in supporting people. um, Sorry, I play a small part in supporting people with their discharge as well, and or also transferred to a psychiatric hospital from prison. So sometimes it gets to a point where, do you know what, we can't manage this particular person. They need medication, and here in the UK, the Mental Health Act does not apply in prison. So if somebody is really, really unwell, we do actually have to transfer them to hospital settings. And I'm not sure how it is in
Okay.
other parts of the world, to be honest.
Yeah. Um, that's something. Like, just going through everything in my head that you just talked about, and how tedious it is and how very intense that working environment is. So one would be very, very curious, like, as that to like what really influenced you to really choose to work in that field, like to take your skills and particularly focus it towards that direction.
Yeah, so I guess I'd have to take you back to before I even studied occupational therapy. So back in school, this is probably I was maybe around 16, 17 years old. In school, we do like work experience days, and I did my work experience at a psychiatric hospital, Maudsley. And then from there, I met an occupational therapist. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I knew I wanted to go into healthcare, but I wasn't so sure. Like, I knew I didn't want to become a doctor because I thought, gosh, that's too much studying. And I didn't want to become a nurse because I thought, oh gosh, I can't deal with all the blood. So I needed to find something in between, right? Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so during my training, so for an occupational therapist, you train usually for 3 years. Um, I got so and you do placements as well. So I got sent to Broadmoor Hospital, which is the UK's most maximum secure hospital. And when I say secure hospital, it means that it's a combination of a psychiatric hospital, but also holding people who have extensive criminal backgrounds, and that's where my, I guess, interest for forensic mental health peaked. And once I qualified, I knew that I wanted to work in that kind of setting. So initially, I started working in a psychiatric hospital, working with people with criminal backgrounds. Um, and then, I worked there for a couple of years, and I thought, you know what, let me just take the leap and work in a prison. Like, I've always been curious about, what exactly goes on beyond the punishment consequence side of things, but, in terms of the mental health aspect as well. So that's kind of where it began.
Yeah, interesting. And how has the experience been so far? And I'm really curious to know how you really manage to like, like to really handle the emotional aspect of it, and how you like manage to keep your cool working in that kind of intense environment and still function very properly to actually provide the best help for people you're taking care of.
Yeah. So I won't sugarcoat anything. It is challenging. Not just working in prison, but working in mental health as well. Like, it can take a toll. And even though we are trained as professionals to deal with certain cases, it still leaves a mark, regardless when you look at a case or you look at a person who's gone through, a lot of trauma, for example, and has gotten to this point where maybe they don't even have capacity to make decisions anymore. um, Working in a prison as well, I knew it would be challenging, but I didn't realize how challenging it would be and how restrictive in terms of what I could do. So, like I said, I was brought in from the health clinical side of things, but I was always constantly reminded that I'm still in the prison. I have to work with the prison regime. I could say, "Oh, I want to do this with a patient, or with a prisoner. I want to take them out," and the officers and the governors could say no. But I think in terms of how I manage the challenges, I think I'm quite good at compartmentalizing, but at the same time as well, like my team, for example, we're very good at ensuring that the well-being of staff is the first priority, because that's how we can provide, the best care obviously for our patients. um I do stuff outside of work as well, so that my mind isn't so consumed with like some of the distressing things that I might see on the ward or on the unit. um so I think that hand in hand gives me a good balance. And of course, like if you're going to go into a field like this, I feel like you do need to have like a genuine interest in it, that would sort of carry you through some of the challenges that you'll face.
Yeah, that's true. Constantly remembering why the reason why you're doing something is a strong how would I put this? Is a strong foundation that holds you and keeps you grounded. Yeah, that's very, very true. So you talked about your TED talk earlier on, and if I'm being really honest, that's how I'm aware of you. I like when I listened to the whole talk, it was something. And first thing first, it was titled "How Far Can Empathy Go." So I'd like to ask you, why did you specifically chose empathy as a focal point of your talk in order to like try to explain the intersection between mental health and the criminal justice system?
Okay, so I chose that title because I guess the obvious thing is that when somebody, especially when you look at the news or the media, when you think of a criminal, you automatically sort of put the blame on them. Oh my gosh, how could they do this? Depending on the type of crime. And I was that kind of person as well. Um, Even in terms of mental health, like my view on mental health was quite little. It was very biased in terms of like the stigma that I was so used to growing up with. But obviously, once I started working with these type of clients and actually getting to know the backstory, I found my empathy sort of, I guess, expanding with knowledge. So hence why the title, How Far Can Your Empathy Go? I wanted to sort of come put across the message, not necessarily condoning the crimes, of these individuals, but actually getting people to try and listen and try and understand some of the stories that I was talking about, because mental health has been spoken about quite a number of times over the recent years, but I feel like when you bring in the criminal justice aspect, or if somebody commits a crime that might be mentally unwell, oftentimes that empathy is capped because of the offenses being committed, and it's capped because of the lack of knowledge around why would somebody go to those lengths to commit something like that. And I always say, like, you have a group of people who have full knowledge of what's happening, and yes, there should be consequences, but I don't feel like we can. I feel like if we don't get to the root of how people get to where they are, I don't think we can solve this whole issue, and it's just going to become a whole cycle. In the UK, and I'm sure also in other places as well, there's a real issue around reoffending. Forget about the person, going to prison or doing their time, being released. There's a massive number of people who are reoffending, going back to prison, being mentally unwell, and it's a whole cycle that keeps on happening. So I just wanted to, like I said, shine the light on some of the stories, some of the people that I've met that have really impacted my practice and how I see and view mental health and mental illness. And not even just that, I also spoke about neurodiversity as well. So it's just these different elements of, how different people can react to different things depending on a condition, depending on social background, economic status. There's so many different things that, unfortunately, as humans, we don't always have the same empathy for.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And I was this particular. I would say this particular episode has been the one that has given me most to think about, and because of some of the reasons you talked about, saying we need to basically understand how things get to the way, or we need to understand like the origin, the foundation of specific issues, and that's the best way we can actually tackle these issues and try and find solutions that work. Um, because I was particularly interested in how in what's going on in the Nigerian criminal justice with people who have mental health challenges. And I was like, okay, Nigeria is in a unique spot given the fact that we have very limited mental health professionals, very, very limited. There's not even enough to like take care of, like to attend to like the general public, not to talk about going into the criminal justice system and working with prisoners who have those kind of issues. So, and I was like, okay, what's going to be like the best way of approaching this issue is actually getting to the root of it and understanding why these kind of things happen and what are the things that we can do as individuals, as a community together to help support people who have mental health challenges so as not to have them ending up in the justice system. And the role of empathy, like you talked about, is a big one, and it comes into play when we're specifically talking about issues like this. So I guess my question would be, in what specific ways can we show empathy towards people who have mental health challenges as individuals, firstly, and as a society as a whole?
Mm. Um, it's first of all, it's just to listen and to hold that safe space for that person to just tell their story. It doesn't matter if you think it's right or wrong. Like I said, you know, I treat and I meet with people who have committed horrendous crimes. That's not my concern. My concern is, what were the different factors that led to that point. But also, like I wanted to mention, because I'm Nigerian as well, right? So my in terms of the knowledge around mental health, I feel like still to this day, there's a lot of misconceptions around what mental health is, right? And
Hmm.
how serious to take it. Usually
Hmm.
it's like, okay, when a person quote unquote goes mad, then okay, there's something wrong with this person. But actually there were several triggers and several points in which you could have seen that this person might be going down a slippery slope. And I meet with a lot of people from an African background, or a culture that doesn't necessarily embrace mental health as much as physical health, for example. So I think that's also something that we need to look at in terms of trying to get to their level to destigmatize the notion that they already have around mental health. And no, it's not just madness, or the person's life isn't just over, or it's not just all about medication, or it's not just you know what did I say, like it's not just a spell or something like that. So that's another thing that I'm working actually alongside my colleagues and the team as well, in terms of just understanding how we can get across to families, to patients who are from a different cultural background, to get them to understand what mental health is. And I do believe that with doing that, we can definitely save a lot of people from getting to that crisis point. Because that's the thing, like there is no, mental health. There's a whole spectrum, and also nobody is exempt from suffering from a mental health illness, or having poor mental health. But I think the lack of resources, the lack of language in terms of understanding what's going on within the mind is also quite important. But yeah, all of those things that I've just mentioned um, is stuff that I think is really important. As much as we are talking about mental health, I guess maybe I've got my more clinical hat on as well, because I see people come through the doors time and time again, and it's like, no, my son isn't mad, or no, it's this, it's that, and I'm like, no. Listen, like I understand what you're saying, because maybe that's how you've grown up, but it's just trying to come down to their level. It's really, sometimes it's really sad to see, I'll be honest with you. And I do feel like at times I have to be like an advocate for them, especially when it pertains to the system, because a lot of black men, for example, you'll find them a lot in prisons, you'll find them a lot in psychiatric hospitals sectioned. And I do feel that, there could have been ways to avoid it if there was an intervention at an earlier stage.
Yeah, I totally and completely agree with that part. Um, and going back to what you just said, talking about having to deal with like a mother who's yelling, "My son is not mad," or they don't have issues or whatnot. One of the things you talked about in your talk, your TEDx talk, was the correlation between undiagnosed neurodevelopmental conditions and young adults who find themselves in the criminal justice system. And you talked about how even that was one of the first thing you noticed when you started working in the prison system was a lot of people are here because there was really not enough maybe funding in their society or proper mental health structures to actually um, diagnose them earlier on. And because they missed that diagnosis at an earlier stage, it leads to the point that that's like, it's just like a continuous, how would I put this? Process that leads to them finding themselves in the position they are in. And I think that's the reason why um, a mother would actually say, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with my child," given and when originally you like there wasn't enough resources, or maybe they were not properly educated enough to notice some certain signs and symptoms at an earlier age, and then maybe put a finger on that and try to get like an official diagnosis about what's wrong. Maybe they would have started like sort of like paying attention more or treating them um, with like being more vigilant, like I would say. So can you actually talk about like the correlation between undiagnosed neurodevelopmental issues and other mental health conditions and like
Yeah.
the criminal justice system?
So when it comes to neurodevelopmental conditions, like, usually, they in terms of when they should be diagnosed, or the best time, is usually from childhood. So, like, maybe in schools, for example, or parents. But unfortunately, not everybody is as well educated in terms of what signs to look out for. It's not necessarily the parents' fault. It's not. I can't say there's anyone in particular to blame, but it's more about ensuring that everyone has the right resources, which I think is also a privilege. Like, there are some communities who don't have the enough resources to understand, oh, my child is, exhibiting certain behaviors, let me take him to a GP or psychologist to be, to check them out. Like, not everybody has that privilege of knowing. So that's definitely contributed to why a lot of children as well, young people, are going through the system, going through the education system, struggling, for example, or, you know um presenting with behavioral challenges. Um, for example, maybe they might be sent to like a PRU. So PRUs are like, pupil referral units. So especially if a child is really challenging in a school, they'll take them out and put them in like a class or a school for those who are very challenging, basically, right? And I think I also mentioned that in the talk as well. That's a definite pipeline to somebody, potentially going down the prison route, because they're being taken out of their environment. They're being isolated, less opportunities, and also the core of what's actually happening within their brains or how they process things isn't being resolved. So they start acting out aggressively. And, I did talk about a prisoner that I worked with who had autism. It was not diagnosed. When I met him, he didn't have any diagnosis, came through from the police cell straight to us. And I could see from the minute I saw him, I could see that something was not right. He wasn't making eye contact, none of that stuff. And, eventually he was diagnosed, after we did all the assessments. But I thought to myself, how, first of all, how could we bring somebody like this into prison knowing that he hasn't even got the capacity to understand what is happening within, in his surroundings. And there was no history about any you know observations in school or anything like that. And again, it tends to happen a lot to black people, black men, because um aggression usually is, or a certain, maybe disrupting the class, for example, is seen as aggression, instead of maybe seen as somebody who might have issues paying attention, like an attention deficit, compared to, let's say, our white counterparts, where it's like, oh no, this person has ADHD. But then with the black people, it's like, no, they're aggressive. So there's also that systemic racism that's still occurring, even within the healthcare system too, that unfortunately we find a lot of people in prison where it's like, okay, yes, they've committed a crime, but clearly they're not well. Clearly there's something going on. So it's yeah, it's something that I think. needs to be looked at. The prisons that I'm working in at the moment, they've actually just recently developed um, a separate unit specifically for those who are more vulnerable, shall I say. So they could have a neurodevelopmental condition, a mental health condition, and essentially is to explore the areas in where they need more support. And I do believe that every prison should have that. It's not necessarily just about punishment. Like I said, it's just going to be a continuous cycle if we don't address certain things. But yeah, I would say that.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that also. And when we talk about issues like this, people might like roll their eyes to be like, oh, maybe that's not the case, going back to the aggression, maybe black people are just too aggressive, or young boys, or other of this stereotypes that allow us to push things aside and not basically give ourselves time to really think about the issues, because that would require for us to make certain uncomfortable changes that maybe holding on to our certain beliefs that we've had all our lives. And there was like some quick facts that I actually found out, which is like people with mental health illness are more likely to be arrested and incarcerated, and people with like than normal people with neurodevelopmental issues also are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. And even in Nigeria, right? Currently, the mental health Nigerian organization, along with other organizations, are currently fighting to pass a bill, "Suicide Not a Crime" (NG). I don't know if you've heard about it. And that's one of the most like one of the things that people don't actually understand in Nigeria is attempted suicide is actually a crime, and people um, who are found guilty would have to spend like a year in like the prison or something like that. And that's like, it is clear that somebody who tries to take their life are not probably in the right psychological state at that particular point. And
Yeah.
then taking that person and putting them through the justice system and just putting them in prison without really thinking about like what's really going on. Like, this person doesn't clearly belongs in the prison, this person belongs in an institution where they can actually get help, or like,
Mhm.
it's like a cry for help basically. And
Absolutely.
a lot of Nigerians don't actually know this. So yeah, you can go ahead if you want to speak
Yeah, and,
to
and
that.
also you just like reminded me as well. I think was it last year that the mental health act bill
Bill,
was passed, and before
yeah,
it was the lunatic or
yes,
something. That's I
yeah,
can't remember word for word, but to
the
me, I
lunacy
was
act. Yes,
the
yes,
Lunacy Act, right? And
yes,
honestly, when I read that, I was so shocked. I mean, of course, I understood that mental health isn't really taken as seriously in Nigeria, but I just thought, wow, in 2022, and it's now that it's been changed to, it's ridiculous, but it goes to show that, um, you know, the lack of education around mental health and how serious it is and how it can link to people committing offenses. Trying to take your life is not an offense, obviously, but I don't, due to maybe culture or just again lack of awareness, lack of empathy, unless you're actually being put in that position yourself, can be really detrimental, as we can clearly see. So, um, I can see that there's a lot of places, countries that still have a long way to go. Um, and yeah, it's just a shame that it's taken this long, but hopefully now with like obviously yourself, other organizations that are shedding more of a light on mental health, and also like making it a more comfortable conversation, like it's not a taboo. I think that's also key. Like, even if you don't understand, because again, even with my family as well, like they might not necessarily understand, like, what is this whole mental health thing, but they're willing to listen. That's all I need. I just need you to be willing to listen and to get that it's actually the same. If you break a leg, obviously you go to the hospital. If you break your mind, so to say, you need to get that support as well. Yeah.
yeah. I completely agree with that. And that's like going back to the first things first. I would like to. You talked about the Mental Health Act being passed last year. A lot of a lot of that work was actually done by the same Mental Health Nigeria, led by Chima Sonye and other organizations as well. And at the same, just like you talked about in 2022, you're passing the Mental Health Act. It's the same thing that in 2023, suicide is still a crime in Nigeria, and that just goes to show you like we do have a long way to go. There are ways people can actually support what these amazing organizations are really trying to do. I would actually link the petition that is being signed online about the suicide not a crime bill in this episode, so people can actually take that actionable step by just signing the petition online and just educating themselves about what these issues are. And just talking about making the conversation more frequent and just destigmatizing the whole mental health talk and making it not a taboo. It's part of the reason why I basically like to have conversations around it, but still making mental
Yeah.
health like the centerpiece, right? We can talk about, because I think one of the ways to actually bring us along and a lot of people along the conversation is like, okay, understanding what mental health is from a cultural perspective. About So we can talk about issues with mothers, we can talk about issues with um, heartbreaks or whatever it is, but it all centers around the same mental health conversations, and people can begin to understand it. Because I always use this analogy, and it's kind of funny. Like when I was way much younger, right? When you have a friend who's like always anxious, right? We have this thing. We'll be like, "Yeah, like why you too the fear? Like you fear too much. Like, what's the problem?" We didn't actually understand that like the person is actually exhibiting some symptoms of like anxiety or something, right? You see, it took me a very long time to actually understand that young people do get depressed, and when we were younger and we had certain issues in our minds or like our friends or whatever that was bothering them, there's this talk that is always like, and what are you thinking about? Do you have kids you're feeding? Or like
Mm.
you're too young to be thinking, and the rest of it. It took me a long time. And when I was able to like properly educate myself, and I'm still educating myself about mental health, to actually understand that maybe that person was going through a depressive episode. So
Mm.
us as a community having the conversation around mental health and trying to get us all along to understand that there's certain things that pops up in our life daily that we may not necessarily be thinking about it as what mental health is, but that's it right there displaying in our very face. And people can begin to understand that mental health isn't like, when we talk about mental health, it's not like when somebody is quote unquote like has like a schizophrenic episode, or the person is like really exhibiting this really, because that's what people tend to associate it with. And getting back to the conversation, when you talked about like when we are talking about the intersection of mental health and the justice system, I'm still trying to go back to understand like the root cause of it and how we can help prevent that pipeline, like you talked about, like for those things not to come to play. You said something really, really profound in your TED talk, and you were talking about the fact that people who have mental health challenges or neurodevelopmental issues are even targeted by real criminals. It's called mates crime, right? They are targeted by real criminals, and they are being forced or persuaded or, I don't know, blackmailed or whatever the case is, due to like they are isolated, like you rightly pointed out, like taking them out of like their loving and supporting environment and isolating those individuals actually leaves them in the open for people who have like evil intentions to actually use them for their as a
Yeah.
tool to actually achieve whatever crime or whatever intentions they actually have in mind. So is that something you can really speak more about and elaborate on a little bit so we can actually understand that?
Yeah, I think some people don't actually realize that a lot of prisoners or, people who have gotten themselves in certain situations are vulnerable themselves. So, like I said, with the mates crimes, there's also another term called cuckooing. So, essentially, that's when you know a gang of people, or even just one or two people, they actually take over a vulnerable person's home and use that to sell whether drugs or commit another crime. So taking over somebody's home because they are deemed as vulnerable. And that's another thing, is like that vulnerability in terms of that could be in terms of maybe being financially vulnerable. So maybe somebody who hasn't got any money, hasn't got any hope, and it's like this is the only way that they feel that they can survive, or um, you know acceptance. Maybe they don't come from a background in terms of having a family or stable home. So there's so many different factors apart from quote unquote somebody being evil enough just to do that crimes. There's so many other factors that can make somebody get to that position. And again, like when I do speak to them, because I do have one-on-one conversations with a lot of offenders, and asking them, okay, so why did you do this? What led you to that point? And it's kind of like, well, if I didn't steal this, I'd be on the street. If I didn't do this, my mom, my younger siblings, they wouldn't be able to eat. Or there's so many different stories. Hence why I'm like, just listen to people. You don't have to agree, but just listen, because that's when you truly get to understand like how somebody has gotten to that point. So it's definitely that vulnerability aspect. And I guess it's kind of like uh you know this a juxtaposition or something like that, in terms of most people don't view criminals as being vulnerable. Um, but at the end of the day, I do feel like everybody, has the potential to commit a crime. Let's say that, like, if you're being pressed in terms of like your situation, whether that's financially, socially, emotionally, you everybody has the potential to. I've met so many people who are doctors, lawyers, business people who are in an unfortunate situation in terms of their mental health, and unfortunately get leading them to commit a crime. So there isn't it's not a one size fits all. And like you already said, like with mental health as well, there's an entire spectrum. It's not just about the extreme end where somebody's, you know, in a full blown psychosis. It could also be that person who's, depressed, who's not, unable to come out of their house for whatever reason, is who's always anxious, who can't pay attention, who gets angry, maybe bipolar. There's so many different spectrums as well. And I also kind of wanted to touch on, I think you mentioned something that triggered this as well. Generational trauma. It's a massive thing. I feel like we mustn't forget about the older generation as well. So like our parents, grandparents, and whatnot, because they too have endured trauma. They might not verbalize it as trauma, but they too have endured trauma that unfortunately does get passed on to their offspring, right? So for example, like I remember this is when I was working in the community. I was working with a lady who would not come out of her house. Her house was, I kid you not, I could barely I could barely squeeze into her house. Like there were so many boxes. She was hoarding, like hoarding upon hoarding upon hoarding. And it was actually I think she was from Congo. She was a Congolese lady. And we were sort of trying to understand why does she keep hoarding? Why does she keep hoarding? Like, what's going on? She also had a mental health problem, but as eventually, when we actually looked into her background, she came into the UK. Well, when she was in Congo, she didn't have anything. She was homeless, right? She didn't have anything. So her way of coping was to not get rid of anything. She felt like if she threw away stuff, she might never ever get it back. And sometimes you joke, like for example, I joke with my mom. I'm like, oh, you keep packing too many things. Like, why do you keep doing this? But not to like obviously make any type of behavior into like a mental health thing. But when you look at, let's say, your parents or the older generation's behavior, sometimes you can. It's also about having that empathy for them as well. So trying to understand like how their upbringing might have been like, that can obviously affect like their children and whatnot.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm talking about that. It took me a very long time to actually realize that my mother was another human being, and
Mm.
that's crazy. But yeah, it took me a long time. It took me um, until I was like, I think 20 or 21 before I actually realized that my mother is a person. Because for the longest of time, we tend to look at our parents as some form of demigods. They don't have issues, they don't have no problem, they are always there, they always have the right answers, and like they don't make mistakes and the rest of it. But getting to a certain age where I started being cautious of my environment and conscious of the things that was happening around me, that was when I truly realized that my mother is actually a person that has her own issues and her own troubles. And given the fact that she pushed those things to the side, doesn't want you to see their weakness or their down points, because they want to be there for you and show you a certain type of life, or whatever the case is. They are also people. And I think that's one of the harshest reality that actually hits us as young adults when we start coming of age and expressing ourselves in the world. Our personalities kind of like collide with our parents and people around us, and then we get to understand that, like, oh, this person is just like me. All of these things I'm actually feeling inside of me. All of this issues I'm dealing with that I feel nobody understands, that I feel I don't have the right words to communicate it, and the rest of it. Your parents actually feel that way. Your sister feels that way. Your friend feels that way. So when you call up that friend and that person is not picking up the call or whatnot, like, you have to put that into account, take that into account when you're looking at things. So yeah, that's I think that's when you talk about generational trauma, that's something we have to recognize as young people and understand
Mm.
what's really playing out right before our very eyes. And we can, if we do take account of that and take note of that, it will help us best navigate certain issues around us, and help us have great relationship with our parents, with our siblings, and even with our friends and the community at large. And that empathy then comes in, like, even with strangers, you do know that, okay, whatever, because I talk about this story a lot. That's very, very crazy. It's like, so my mother passed on 2 years ago, and the day she actually passed on, the next day I was inside of a public bus, and me and my sister were actually heading somewhere, and I was sitting down on the bus, and the world was just going on. And surprisingly, it's like nobody actually knew what was wrong with me. Like, I came down, I had a smile on my face, like, and all, I was just going on about my day. So a couple of months after that, it made me think, right? Because I was like, okay, what if the next person walking by me right now, or the person that mistakenly spills a drink or something or whatever, is actually processing and dealing with something very, very crushing at every moment you see anybody walking past you. And that's when that empathy thing comes. It just makes me start looking at life differently, like really, really differently, and just trying to understand that we're all going through it. And it's just really amazing as human beings that we can keep it together. That's the most
Mm.
fascinating thing. Like, how do you
It's like a
manage to keep it
survival
together?
instinct. It's like a survival instinct, you know. It's you don't want to break. You like you said as well. Like people walking around masking their feelings, masking like what's going on within the mind, and the mind is so powerful as well. It's just it's unfortunate because there's only so much that we can take. Obviously, people have different I guess tolerances. Like you've got people who go through different types of trauma, and some people are able to get to the other side. But for some other person, there could just be one trigger that just makes them snap, and it's like, okay, the world's over. They go and do this, or yeah. So you just never know. And I do feel like yourself, like as I'm getting older, I'm being more empathetic because I'm like, well, I haven't got my ish together, and there's certain stuff that I've sort of dealt with, like, and nobody. It seems that not nobody, but like when I go outside, like in in a room full of strangers, they don't know my story, but I'm still having to smile and speak to people. So it's just extending that same grace to other people around us, and especially the older generation as well. And I do feel I am very proud to be in this current generation where it's like we are more vocal about these type of things. We're more willing to put in the effort to change, make political changes that obviously affect um so many people, but we're also able to kind of stand our ground towards the older generations who are still there, but mustn't get left behind. I feel like we still need to bring them on board as well, because there is still so much work to be done from their side as well as our side too.
Yeah, I totally agree. And getting back to the conversation, talking about people who are vulnerable due to maybe mental health challenges or neurodevelopmental issues, how can we, as friends, family, as a community, actually help protect these people so they don't get exploited by by the real criminals, like we rightly talked about earlier on?
Yeah,
Because
speak.
uh, sorry, you did say something about training or like working with people like that to be more assertive, right? So they don't actually fall for things like that. So yeah, sorry for cutting you short. I just have this thing of
Yeah.
wanting to get
So
everything off my head.
no, it makes sense. So like I would say, yeah, so being assertive, um, before I say that though, I want to say it's everybody's responsibility, right? To support people who are vulnerable. So yes, of course I would always ask the person as much as you can to speak up if you feel like something's happening, like especially when it comes to like criminal activity. But I mean, we both know that not everybody might have the confidence to sort of speak up, maybe out of fear or maybe just out of just not knowing whether they're going to receive the right help. So it's also, I feel like the responsibility is also on friends, family, people who are around that person. If you see something that's quite dodgy, speak up. Even if you're wrong, just speak up, because sometimes there is comfort in knowing, especially for the vulnerable, I would say victim, they are victims. There is comfort in knowing that there is somebody else looking out for them. And also I would say education, I'll go back to education, is also very key as well. If it wasn't for me obviously doing my degree working in this field, I don't think I would be as educated on certain mental health conditions or certain neurodevelopmental conditions. But through this, I've made a point to do my research. Even like I have friends who have bipolar, for example. I'll do my research, try and educate myself, ask questions if they feel comfortable to share, so that I know, how best to support them when they are, let's say, in a crisis or whatnot. So I think it's definitely a collective thing, but also most importantly is creating that safe space. You'd be very, very surprised, like how much you can get out of a person when there is a safe environment for them to just speak their truth, really. Um, and I think it also goes both ways as well, because if you, let's say in my friendship group, for example, I would say I've got a really good friendship group. But I know that if I ever needed something, I could go to them because that safe space has been created. I know that there are people who will be able to support me, or if they can't support me, they can go and find help for me as well. So, um, yeah, like I said, it's a collective responsibility in terms of supporting people who are deemed vulnerable.
My next question is talking about supporting like the vulnerable people around us and the rest of it. Are there specific programs or initiatives that have been put in place, like in the UK, that you see that actually have some positive impacts that people can actually adopt, like especially us, like in Nigeria here?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but initiatives that focus on reintegration back into the community, especially for offenders who have been released. Oftentimes, they are released with nothing but a plastic bag with their clothes, and it's kind of like, okay, so what do you expect them to do next? Like I said, it's just going to become a whole cycle. So ensuring that you know they have that support regarding their daily function, whether that's finding work, gaining new skills. Even I think you touched on it before, like loneliness as well. Like who are they going back to? Do they have a support network? And yeah, so that's one aspect I think is really key. Another thing as well I would say is around, I think it's around community type of community based interventions. So and I say this because it's quite easy to do, especially with social media being on an all time, everybody has social media these days, and it's just utilizing that in the best way possible. So for example, with where I work at the moment, they're very keen on getting us as healthcare professionals to go on, let's say, TikTok, for example, and provide valid information. Because the issue is, and I was asked this before in terms of, what do you feel about, how do you feel about people who post videos and self-diagnosing themselves to be on social media, and I think we can go down a dangerous slope with the misinformation that's being spread. So that's why I feel like we as health professionals need to meet them halfway as well, and experts as well in various different fields. Um, so yeah, being on social media has worked. Like I said, the reintegration back into community has worked as well. And also like just I think it's also initiatives that focus on young people as well. So going into schools, for example, and planting that seed from an early age at an early stage. So talking about mental health, talking about safe spaces, their rights, things to look out for, just general things. Like you don't have to go so deep, but I feel like if we can teach the younger generation at an earlier age in terms of how to take care of their well-being, um, they will have so much knowledge to start growing and developing with. And again, this isn't something that I really had much when I was younger. I The first time I really heard about mental health was through watching TV. So I think there's so much scope for us to do things outside of the prison setting, outside of the hospital setting. So going into schools, going into communities, being online, and just infiltrating the right information in different spaces.
Yeah, I completely agree. Talking about using social media as a tool for professionals also is something I'm a very big advocate of. And that's because one of the most dangerous thing, or one of the most scary thing, at least to me, that I've really noticed on social media, like in the mental health space, or people talking about things surrounding mental health, is individuals
Mm.
who are not professionals propagating what seems to be their coping mechanism as a proper solution for the rest of the world, right? I think that's a very, very dangerous part, like you talked about, like a very high level of misinformation that can actually cause real life harm. So I would also like to like employ people to recognize that's actually a phenomenon that's actually taking place on the internet. As much as we want to actually get help and understand what mental health is and the different topic and subjects surrounding mental health, we should also be constantly aware that some people are actually propagating their own coping mechanism, which might actually be wrong, for example, or which might not be right, or maybe it fits their particular case or issues or whatever the case is. Yes, but I just think that's something as like a real danger.
Absolutely, yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I don't, to be honest, I don't even know if there's like a right or wrong. Obviously, as long as you're not going to the extremes, right? But it's just people's experiences. And that alone, I think, has been really powerful, especially in a positive way, because even like for me, when I go on, let's say TikTok, for example, and I see somebody who's posted a video about anxiety, for example, I can relate to that. So to me, I feel like, okay, I'm not the only one who's experiencing this. But like you said, it's like it's just ensuring that there is a good balance, because and that's another thing. I also tell people to take things as, with a pinch of salt. What will work for somebody might not always work for you, and that's why it's always really important that you should seek professional help, obviously if it gets to a stage where it's detrimental. But to not just solely rely on what's on social media, or like even when people say, oh, to relax, do some meditation. I can't meditate, like I can't concentrate for that long. It doesn't work for me, but it might work for somebody else. So it's also about trial and error and understanding what works for you.
Yeah, I completely agree. So rounding up the conversation, you talked about a very inspiring story of Toby on your TED Talk, and I think that actually gave me a sense of hope that what you are actually doing is not only laudable and commendable, but also very, very important, and it has real life implication, and the effects of it can actually be measured. So I don't know if you can actually share like a story of someone who has actually gotten better due to like the help, getting the right help and support, and maybe that can, I don't know, inspire somebody to actually go in the same direction, or do something.
Yeah, there's so many success stories from early intervention, so supporting people from the earlier stages. I've done a lot of work in schools, in pupil referral units especially. So usually they're looked at in society as people who there's no hope for them. They're just stubborn, they're challenging, that there's no way they could amount to anything in life. But actually seeing them go to university or do certain, good jobs, and actually being able to make a life of themselves is really heartwarming for me, because it's like I'm seeing somebody that looks like me. I'm seeing somebody that could potentially be my brother, be my sister. In hospitals and prisons as well, like, seeing somebody who's coming in a complete psychotic state or depressive state, having no hope for the future, no family, no necessarily, feeling like there's no way out, to then volunteering in the shop, or going on to do great things in life. And it's not to say that they might not struggle from time to time, because that's another message that I don't want to come across, in a sense that, oh, if you have therapy, if you have this, you're totally healed, that's it. No,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
just as we're humans, we're going to fluctuate from time to time, right? So it's just understanding that you can have a good quality of life even though you've endured mental health, you've endured, this or that traumatic events. Like, you can still go on to have that. But with the stories that I've told, and this, and still the cases till now that I'm seeing, I meet people at different stages, and sometimes they need. I always say there's this one thing, I don't know who I got it from. It might have been like my previous consultant. I always say to them, I think he said to me, if they can't hold the hope for themselves, you hold the hope for them until they're able to get to that stage. So I always try, like, I say to people, look, you might not have any goals right now. You might feel like you just want to die. Let me hold the hope for you until you get to the point where you can.
Yeah, that's actually very lovely. We started off this conversation talking about how you manage the stress and the challenges that comes with what you do, and we're ending it on a good note, talking about like success stories and the rest of it. So, I also like to ask, how rewarding is it? Is it when you actually see people make positive changes due to the help and assistance and support you've been able to offer and offer to them basically? How does that make you feel? How do you manage that emotion basically?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've done something right, like, no matter how small the changes are. Um and it makes me feel like I'm in the right type of field. Like I said, I've always wanted to help people, but I wasn't sure how. Um, I feel like, obviously I'm in a unique position where, I'm working with people who are deemed, you know, just dispensable really to the media, to whoever, but being able to turn that around and give somebody a new sort of view of life, and working as part of a team. I think that's also key as well. Like, knowing that I've played, whether it's a small part or whether it's a big part, I've played a part in somebody being able to live life again and have another chance at life. So yeah, like, it makes it worth it, especially when I am sort of finding the days challenging, or if there's an incident or something like that. I sort of go back to remembering, like, all the other positive cases that we've been able to be a part of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going. We are rooting for you, and I don't know. You're very, very, what you're doing is
Thank
very,
you.
very important, and and I don't know, all the love, joy, support, care from everyone. So before we go, firstly, is there anything you'd like to leave us with as we round up? Is there anything at all you'd like, maybe something you feel you want to get off your chest?
I think I've kind of mentioned it all. Obviously, it's like, I just want to encourage people to try and be more empathetic. It's not necessarily about putting yourself in their shoes. Sometimes it's impossible because it's a different experience, but it's just being willing to listen. Just be willing to listen and see how far that can take you.
Yeah, great. And how can people find you online, and where can they find you exactly?
Yeah, so they can find me on Instagram, so at Jen Okolo, on Twitter at Jen Okolo, and then you can also find me on LinkedIn. I've connected with a lot of people on LinkedIn, which is amazing. So please do reach out if you want to, and then also via my business as well. So www.wearesasa.com, so you can check out our website for any resources.
Yeah, I'll put a link to all of that attached and attach them to this episode so people can just easily click on it just in case they're having a hard time like going online to find things. You know, we're very lazy sometimes. But again, I'd like to again I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I really, really appreciate it. And all the best. I'll be in touch, and hopefully, maybe we can do this in the future again. Um, yeah, we're rooting for you,
Definitely.
and
Yeah.
do enjoy the rest of your day and take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.